Princess Sylvana stood in front of the grand mirror inside her chamber, taking a deep breath. Her silver-blue skin shimmered under the soft glow of the floating lights, and her deep violet eyes reflected both authority and unease. Today was an important day, one that could shape the future of her people. She was about to meet a human. The very thought made her stomach tighten. The Aelari Dominion had ruled the stars for thousands of years. Their people were known for their intelligence, grace, and above all, control over emotions. To lose composure, even for a second, was a sign of weakness. And yet the humans, they were unpredictable, loud, emotional, unrefined. Sylvana had studied their history, their habits, even their strange humor. Humans were different from any species the Aelari had encountered. They were fearless, stubborn, and most disturbingly, they thrived in chaos. This meeting was supposed to be diplomatic, an effort to strengthen ties between their species. But why had they chosen a soldier to represent them? Wouldn't a scholar or a diplomat be more appropriate? A knock at the chamber door broke her thoughts. "Enter," she commanded, her voice calm as always. The doors slid open, and her royal advisor, Lord Valeth, stepped inside. He was an elder Aelari with silver hair and an air of wisdom about him. His expression was unreadable, but his violet eyes held concern. "It is time, Your Highness," he said. Sylvana gave a slow nod, straightening her posture. "Let us proceed." She followed him down the grand hallway, her long robes flowing like liquid silver behind her. The palace was built of crystal and light, a place of elegance and serenity. Every step echoed with authority, yet Sylvana's thoughts remained restless. Would this human be as reckless as the stories suggested? The first meeting. The grand hall was silent when she entered. High-ranking Aelari officials stood along the edges, their expressions carefully neutral. Across the chamber, waiting near the diplomatic podium, was the human soldier, Captain Ilias Mercer. Sylvana felt something strange when she saw him. He was tall, much taller than most Aelari males. His uniform was crisp, dark blue with golden insignias, yet it lacked the regal elegance of Aelari robes. His shoulders were broad, his stance relaxed but confident. And his eyes met hers without hesitation. That was the first shock. Most species avoided direct eye contact with Aelari royalty. It was a sign of respect. Yet Ilias Mercer stood there, looking at her with an easy, unwavering gaze, as if she were just another person, not a princess of an interstellar empire. Sylvana quickly controlled her reaction. She would not allow a mere human to unnerve her. She stepped forward with the practiced grace of her kind. "Captain Mercer," she greeted, her voice smooth, devoid of emotion. Ilias placed a hand on his chest and gave a small nod. It was not a deep bow, not a formal greeting. It was casual. "Princess Sylvana," he replied, his voice deep and calm. "Nice place you got here." Sylvana blinked. Nice place. Her mind took a moment to process the simplicity of his words. The Aelari homeworld was a jewel of the cosmos, a masterpiece of architecture and technology. No one had ever described it as simply a nice place. She forced herself to maintain her composure. "I trust your journey was comfortable." Ilias gave a small shrug. "Well, the ship food was terrible. But other than that, not bad." Sylvana was sure she heard a quiet gasp from one of her officials behind her. No one spoke so casually in a royal diplomatic setting. Yet Ilias seemed completely unaware of the disturbance he was causing. Or worse, he didn't care. An unsettling presence. As the introductions continued, Sylvana found herself growing more and more aware of the human. He did not stand stiffly like other diplomats. He did not choose his words with careful precision. Instead, he spoke as he pleased, answering questions directly, sometimes even adding a small smirk as if he found the entire situation amusing. It was both frustrating and fascinating. She had expected arrogance, but Ilias Mercer did not seem arrogant. He seemed comfortable. Too comfortable, as if standing in a room full of high-ranking Aelari did not intimidate him in the slightest. She had seen warriors tremble in her presence. She had witnessed entire species bow before her people. But this human, he was completely at ease. Sylvana kept her expression neutral, but inside, she was struggling. Not with fear, not with anger, but with something else entirely. Curiosity. Elias Mercer was different. He did not fear the Aelari. He did not hide behind polite formalities. He was real. And that, more than anything, made him dangerous. Sylvana took a slow breath, reminding herself of her duty. This was only the beginning. Aelari diplomacy required patience. She would observe this human, study him, and learn how his kind thought. Because one thing was certain, Captain Elias Mercer was going to be a problem. Princess Sylvana sat on her throne, her expression calm and unreadable. The grand hall was filled with Aelari diplomats, all watching the human with careful curiosity. Captain Elias Mercer stood in the center, completely at ease. That was the problem. Most species showed some level of discomfort in the presence of the Aelari. Their telepathic abilities, their cold elegance, their long history as one of the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy. It all commanded a natural respect. Yet this human acted as if he belonged here. Sylvana had met diplomats from countless species before. They always spoke with careful words, always bowed just a little too deeply. But Elias Mercer, he did neither. His posture was relaxed, his gaze steady. He stood with his hands behind his back, his stance almost casual, but not careless. There was an energy to him, a confidence that seemed unnatural. And worst of all, she couldn't stop noticing it. A different kind of soldier. Captain Mercer, Sylvana spoke, her voice smooth and regal. Before we proceed with formal discussions, I wish to understand your role. You are a soldier, not a diplomat. Why have the humans chosen you for this meeting? Elias tilted his head slightly, a small smirk playing on his lips. That's a good question, Princess. Sylvana narrowed her eyes. Was he stalling? The way I see it, Elias continued, your people know plenty about human scholars and politicians. You've studied our history, our way of thinking, but you've never had to deal with a human soldier up close. He took a step forward, not aggressively, but with purpose. The Aelari officials around him tensed slightly, but Elias either didn't notice or didn't care. We don't just fight, he said. We adapt. We think on our feet. We figure out solutions in ways others don't. And sometimes, he gave a small shrug. A soldier knows when to talk instead of fight. Sylvana felt a flicker of something, annoyance, amusement. She wasn't sure. She had expected a warrior with brute strength, someone who relied on instinct rather than intelligence. Instead, Elias Mercer seemed completely aware of his surroundings, of every movement, of every shift in expression. He was studying her just as much as she was studying him. It was unsettling, an unexpected challenge. I see, Sylvana said carefully. So you believe a soldier is better suited for diplomacy than a trained ambassador? Elias chuckled. Not always, but sometimes an ambassador overthinks things. They focus too much on rules and tradition. Me? I like to keep things simple. Simple, Sylvana repeated. Yeah. Elias met her gaze without hesitation. You don't trust humans yet. I get that. So instead of sitting through hours of speeches and polite words, how about we skip the act? You ask what you really want to know, and I'll give you the honest answer. Sylvana felt a strange tension in her chest. This human, he was breaking all the rules. Diplomacy was a dance, an art of careful wording and controlled emotions. Yet here was Elias Mercer, standing in the heart of the Aelari Dominion, challenging her directly. The room was silent. The officials waited, their gazes flickering between their princess and the human. Sylvana let the silence stretch, testing him. Most would break under the weight of an Aelari stare. But Elias, he just waited, arms crossed, as if he had all the time in the world. Unbelievable. Finally, she spoke. "Very well, Captain. If we are to be honest, then tell me, what do humans truly want from the Aelari?" Elias's smirk faded. He considered her question for a moment before answering. "Respect." Sylvana blinked. That was not what she expected. "We don't need your technology," Elias continued. "We don't need your protection. What we need is a seat at the table. We want to be seen as equals, not just another species in your empire." His voice was steady, firm. He wasn't demanding. He wasn't pleading. He was simply stating a fact. For the first time, Sylvana didn't have a prepared response. A dangerous truth. She had heard stories of human ambition, of their relentless drive to explore, to expand, to challenge the impossible. And now, standing before her, was proof of that truth. Elias Mercer was not here to bow. He was not here to impress. He was here to make a statement, and for the first time in her life, Sylvana was uncertain how to respond. She kept her face neutral, her voice steady. "That is a bold request, Captain." Elias smiled slightly. "Yeah, humans tend to be bold." Sylvana exhaled softly. This conversation was not going the way she had expected. But one thing was clear. This human was going to be difficult to ignore. She sat back in her throne, watching him carefully. "Very well," she said at last. "Let us see if your actions match your words." Elias gave a small nod, as if he had already expected that answer. And for the first time, Sylvana realized something disturbing. She was looking forward to seeing what he would do next. The grand hall was quieter than before, but the air between Princess Sylvana and Captain Elias Mercer was thick with unspoken challenges. Their conversation had taken an unexpected turn. The human was different from anyone she had ever met. Most beings, when speaking to an Aelari princess, chose their words carefully. They bowed their heads, spoke in polished sentences, and never dared to challenge the authority of the Dominion. But Elias Mercer was different. His words were simple, direct, sometimes even casual. He didn't try to impress her with grand speeches or complex diplomacy. He spoke as if he had nothing to fear. And that, more than anything, made Sylvana uneasy. She studied him carefully, her violet eyes searching for any sign of hesitation. But the human soldier remained completely relaxed, standing with an air of quiet confidence. If he was nervous, he did not show it. An unwelcome distraction. The formal negotiations had just begun, with Aelari officials and human representatives seated around a long crystal-like table. Sylvana was supposed to be focused. She was supposed to be listening to the trade agreements, the security arrangements, the diplomatic protocols being discussed. But instead, her attention kept drifting back to Elias. It was infuriating. Every time he spoke, his voice had a certain weight to it, steady, unshaken. And whenever he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a small smirk playing on his lips, Sylvana felt an unfamiliar frustration creeping into her mind. This human, he acted as if he belonged here. He acted as if he were equal to the Aelari. And the strangest part, she couldn't bring herself to completely disagree. The first real test. "Your Highness," one of the Aelari ministers spoke, bringing her focus back to the present. "The next discussion concerns military cooperation." Sylvana nodded. "Proceed." The human ambassador, an older man with sharp features, spoke carefully. "We propose a joint defense treaty between our forces. If either of our civilizations faces an external threat, we will assist one another." A murmur passed through the Aelari side of the table. A defense treaty. That was a bold request. Sylvana's gaze flickered toward Elias. The soldier didn't speak, didn't interrupt. He simply watched, his expression unreadable. She turned back to the ambassador. And what, exactly, would humanity contribute to such an agreement? The ambassador hesitated, choosing his words carefully. But Elias, he didn't hesitate at all. "Simple, Elias said, leaning forward slightly. "You've seen what we can do." Sylvana raised an eyebrow. "Enlighten me." Elias smirked. "We're survivors, princess. We don't give up. We don't back down. And we don't stop until the job is done. If your people ever find themselves in a war, trust me, you're going to want humans on your side." His confidence was unshakable. The Aelari officials exchanged uncertain glances. Sylvana remained silent, watching Elias carefully. He truly believed in his words. And worse, he was convincing. She could see it in the eyes of her advisors. The way they were considering his words, weighing the possibilities. Humans were not the strongest species in the galaxy, nor the most advanced. But they had something that others lacked. They refused to be defeated. That was their greatest weapon. A clash of wills. Sylvana leaned back, her fingers tapping lightly against the table. "You speak of strength, Captain Mercer. But strength is not just about survival. It is about discipline, wisdom, and control." Elias nodded. "Agreed. But it's also about knowing when to take risks, when to push forward instead of standing still." He met her gaze, unflinching. Sylvana felt her grip tighten slightly against the armrest of her chair. He wasn't just answering her, he was challenging her. And for the first time in a long time, someone was challenging her in a way that felt real. It was an unsettling realization. She had spent her entire life mastering control. Control over her emotions, control over her thoughts, control over every aspect of her royal presence. But Elias Mercer, he didn't play by the same rules. And something about that made her pulse quicken. An unspoken agreement. The discussions continued, but the tension between Sylvana and Elias never faded. Every exchange was a test, each word carefully measured, each response a move in an invisible game. By the time the meeting ended, Sylvana felt strangely exhausted. As the officials rose from their seats, preparing to leave, Elias gave her a small nod. "That was fun," he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. Sylvana's lips parted slightly. Fun. No one had ever called a diplomatic negotiation fun before. But before she could respond, Elias was already turning away, walking toward the exit with the other human delegates. Sylvana sat in silence for a moment, watching him go. Then, slowly, a small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of her lips. Captain Elias Mercer was unlike anyone she had ever met. And for reasons she couldn't quite understand, she was looking forward to their next meeting. Princess Sylvana sat in her private chambers, staring at the large window that overlooked the Aelari capital city. The skyline was beautiful, tall, silver towers reflecting the soft glow of the twin moons. Normally, this view brought her peace. But tonight, her thoughts were elsewhere. More specifically, on one particular human, Captain Elias Mercer. It had been hours since the meeting ended, yet she could still hear his words. His confidence, his unwavering belief in humanity's strength. He had no fear. That both fascinated and frustrated her. A soft chime interrupted her thoughts. She turned as the doors to her chamber slid open. A tall Aelari warrior entered, bowing slightly. "Your Highness," he said, "the human soldier, Captain Mercer, has accepted the challenge." Sylvana's eyes narrowed. "Already?" The warrior nodded. He agreed without hesitation. She exhaled slowly. Of course he did. The arena awaits. The next morning, a crowd gathered at the Aelari training grounds. It was a grand circular arena, surrounded by high walls and energy shields, a place where warriors tested their skills. Sylvana stood on the royal platform, watching as Elias Mercer stepped into the center of the arena. He was dressed in light combat armor. Aelari standard issue, modified to fit a human. He stretched his arms, rolling his shoulders casually, as if this was just another day for him. Sylvana felt an unfamiliar tension in her chest. Was he really this confident, or just foolish? Across from him stood his opponent, a towering Aelari warrior named Valric, one of the strongest fighters in the Dominion. Valric took a step forward, gripping his staff weapon. His muscles tensed, his expression sharp. "You should have declined, human." Elias smirked. "And miss out on the fun." Sylvanas' fingers curled against the railing. Why did he always say things like that? The battle begins. The signal was given, and Valric moved first. He charged forward, swinging his staff with incredible speed. Most species wouldn't even see the attack coming. But Elias dodged. He twisted his body just enough to let the strike pass inches away, then countered with a quick step to the side. He was fast, much faster than expected. Valric narrowed his eyes. "You're quicker than you look." Elias grinned. "And you're slower than I thought." Sylvanas' eyes widened slightly. Was he taunting Valric? The warrior growled and attacked again, this time even faster. His staff moved like a blur, but Elias weaved through the strikes, his movements precise, almost effortless. The crowd murmured in surprise. A human was keeping up with an Aelari elite. Sylvana couldn't deny it. She was impressed. The strength of a human. But Valric was not done. He feinted left, then spun, striking from behind. This time, Elias couldn't dodge completely. The staff slammed against his side, knocking him back a few steps. Sylvana's breath caught. Was it over? Elias staggered, placing a hand on his ribs. He exhaled sharply, then laughed. He wiped his mouth and looked up at Valric. "Not bad. I actually felt that one." The arena went silent. No one had ever laughed after taking a hit from Valric. Valric frowned, then lunged forward with another powerful swing. But Elias was ready. He caught the staff. Sylvana's eyes widened. That should have been impossible. With a sudden twist, Elias yanked the weapon from Valric's hands and spun it in his own grip. "Hey, this is kinda nice." Valric's shock turned into frustration. He rushed forward to reclaim his weapon, but Elias didn't let him. He used the staff against Valric, striking his legs, forcing him off balance. Then, in one swift motion, Elias swept his feet out from under him. Valric hit the ground. The arena fell completely silent. A human had just taken down one of the Dominion's best warriors. Sylvana could hardly believe it. A new understanding. Elias walked to the edge of the arena and casually tossed the staff aside. He looked up at Sylvana, his usual smirk still in place. "Do I pass the test, Princess?" Sylvana stared at him for a long moment. She could see the sweat on his brow, the bruise forming on his ribs. But he was still standing, still grinning. She took a slow breath, then nodded. "You do." Elias gave her a small salute, then turned to help Valric to his feet. Despite his loss, the Aelari warrior did not look angry. If anything, he looked curious. Maybe, just maybe, humans weren't as reckless as the Dominion once thought. As Elias left the arena, Sylvana found herself thinking about him again. This human was proving to be a far greater mystery than she had anticipated, and for the first time in her life, she wanted to solve it. The arena was still buzzing with whispers long after Elias Mercer had walked out victorious. A human had defeated an Aelari warrior. That was something no one had expected. Princess Sylvana sat in silence, watching as Valric, one of the Dominion's finest, stood at the center of the training ground, his expression unreadable. He had lost. But more than that, he had been surprised. She could understand his shock. She had felt it too. Elias Mercer had proven that humans were not just lucky survivors. They were warriors in their own way. And now Sylvana couldn't deny the truth anymore. Humans were different. The warrior's oath. After the match, Sylvana had expected Valric to leave quietly, perhaps in frustration. Instead, he marched toward the humans' resting area. The training halls were quieter than the arena. Elias was sitting on a bench, casually wiping sweat from his face. He had taken a few hits, but he still looked completely relaxed, as if he had just finished a casual workout, not a battle. Valric stopped in front of him. Elias glanced up. "You here to ask for a rematch already?" Valric didn't smile. Instead, he extended his hand. Elias raised an eyebrow. "Didn't think you liked me that much." Valric sighed. "You fought with honor. You did not win by luck. You won by skill. That is something I respect." Elias studied him for a moment, then nodded. He reached out and shook Valric's hand. "Guess that means we're friends now, huh?" Valric pulled his hand back. "Not friends, but you have my respect." Elias smirked. "I'll take it." Sylvana, who had been watching from the entrance, felt something shift in the air. This was rare. Aelari warriors did not easily accept outsiders. And yet, here was Valric, acknowledging Elias as a worthy fighter. It was another sign that humans were changing everything. An unexpected invitation. Later that evening, Sylvana sat at the royal dining hall, reviewing reports from her advisors. Discussions with the humans were progressing well, but her thoughts kept drifting elsewhere. A voice interrupted her thoughts. "You seem distracted, Your Highness." She looked up and found Elias standing at the entrance, his usual confident smirk on his face. He had changed into formal attire, simpler than Aelari robes, but still well-fitted. Sylvana raised an eyebrow. "What are you doing here?" He leaned against the doorway. "I got an invitation." "From Valric." Sylvana was genuinely surprised. "Valric invited you?" Elias nodded. "He wants me to train with the warriors tomorrow." "Guess I made a good impression." Sylvana considered this. This was highly unusual. The Aelari training grounds were sacred. Only the most skilled warriors were allowed. The fact that Valric had invited Elias meant something. She set her reports aside. "And will you accept?" Elias shrugged. "Why not? I could use the workout." Sylvana sighed. His confidence never faded. Still, something about it intrigued her. A walk in the gardens. The conversation between them did not end there. For some reason, Elias did not leave immediately. Instead, he walked toward the balcony, gazing out at the city. Sylvana found herself watching him. Humans were so different from the Aelari. The Dominion valued tradition, order, and control. But humans, they thrived in chaos. They adapted. They did not follow a strict path. They carved their own. And Elias Mercer was the perfect example of that. She stood up and joined him. The night air was cool, and the stars above shimmered like tiny crystals. Elias glanced at her. "So, Princess, what do you think of humans now?" Sylvana folded her arms. "You are unpredictable." Elias grinned. "I'll take that as a compliment." She hesitated, then said, "You surprise me." Elias's smirk faded slightly. He studied her for a moment, as if trying to read her thoughts. That a good thing or a bad thing? Sylvana looked at him, truly looked at him. The human before her was unlike anyone she had ever met. He challenged her. He frustrated her. But more than anything, he intrigued her. She turned away. "I have not decided yet." Elias chuckled. "Fair enough." For a moment, they stood in silence, looking out at the city. And for the first time since they had met, Sylvana did not feel the need to control the moment. The future of two worlds. The next morning, the Aelari training grounds were busier than ever. A group of warriors gathered, whispering amongst themselves. Valric stood at the center, waiting. And then, Elias arrived. Dressed in Aelari training armor, he walked onto the field with that same confident stride. He looked ready. Sylvana watched from the royal balcony. She had come to observe, not to interfere. She wanted to see what would happen next. Would Elias continue to prove himself? Would the warriors accept him? And most importantly, what did this mean for the future of their two species? As Elias faced off against his next challenger, Sylvana realized something. This human had already changed everything. And she had a feeling he wasn't done yet. Elias Mercer stood in the center of the Aelari training ground, stretching his arms. Around him, a group of Aelari warriors watched in silence. Some were skeptical, others curious. They had all heard the stories. A human defeated Valric in combat. Now, they wanted to see if it was true. Princess Sylvana sat on the royal balcony, observing. She was not sure why she had come to watch again. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something else. But as Elias cracked his neck, flashing that confident grin, she realized something. She wanted to see him win. The challenge begins. Valric stepped forward, standing beside Elias. "Today, you will face 3 of my finest warriors," he announced. His deep voice echoed through the arena. "If you truly have the strength of a warrior, you will prove it here." Elias smirked. 3 against 1. Sounds a little unfair. Valric raised an eyebrow. "You can withdraw if you are afraid." Elias chuckled. "Afraid? No, just wondering if I should fight with one hand tied behind my back to make it fair." A few of the warriors exchanged glances. This human never stopped joking. Sylvana sighed. Would he ever take anything seriously? Valric nodded, then let the trial begin. The first opponent. The first warrior stepped forward, a tall Aelari named Jorik. He carried 2 short blades, his movements swift. Elias raised his fists. He had no weapons, but he didn't seem worried. Jorik attacked first, moving fast. His blades slashed through the air, aiming for Elias's shoulders. But Elias dodged. He weaved between the attacks, moving with calm precision. Then, in a single motion, he grabbed Jorik's wrist, twisted it, and sent him tumbling to the ground. The watching warriors murmured in surprise. Sylvana leaned forward slightly. This was not luck. This was skill. Jorik gritted his teeth and stood up. But Elias just smiled. "Nice try." Jorik hesitated, then nodded in respect. The second opponent. The next warrior stepped up. Her name was Selah. She was smaller than Jorik, but twice as fast. She wielded an energy staff, spinning it skillfully. This time, Elias did not wait. He rushed forward before she could strike, ducked under her staff, and knocked her feet out from under her. Selah hit the ground hard. She rolled quickly, jumping back up, but Elias was already in front of her. He grabbed the staff and yanked it out of her hands. Then, with a smirk, he tossed it aside. "You won't need that." Selah looked stunned, but after a moment, she smiled. She had lost, but she was not angry. She stepped back, bowing slightly. The Aelari warriors whispered again. This human was proving himself. The final opponent. Valric himself stepped forward. The murmurs stopped. This was serious. Valric was one of the strongest warriors in the Dominion, and now he wanted to test Elias one more time. Elias rolled his shoulders. "Didn't we already do this?" Valric smirked. "This time, I will not hold back." The fight began. Valric was stronger, faster, and more experienced than the others. His attacks came in hard and fast. But Elias matched him. Blow after blow, they exchanged strikes, blocking, dodging, countering. Sylvana could feel the tension in the air. This was not just a test. This was a battle of respect. Then, in a blur of motion, Elias won. He twisted around Valric's strike, grabbed his arm, and flipped him onto the ground. The arena went silent. Elias exhaled, wiping sweat from his forehead. That was fun. Valric looked up at him, then laughed. He stood up and clapped Elias on the back. "You are a warrior, Mercer." The other warriors, one by one, nodded in agreement. The human had proven himself. A new bond. Later that evening, Sylvana found herself walking through the palace gardens. She was lost in thought. Elias had done something no outsider had ever done. He had earned the respect of the Dominion's warriors. He had changed their perception of humans. She was beginning to wonder, what else would he change? She turned a corner and found Elias sitting on a bench, looking up at the stars. He noticed her and grinned. Couldn't sleep either. Sylvana hesitated, then sat beside him. The night was quiet, peaceful. "You fought well today," she said finally. Elias smirked. "Coming from you, I'll take that as a high compliment." She glanced at him. "You do not act like a soldier." Elias chuckled. "And you don't act like most princesses." Sylvana frowned. "Is that a good thing?" Elias smiled. "I haven't decided yet." She stared at him. Then, to her own surprise, she laughed. It was the first time she had ever laughed with a human. As the stars shone above them, Sylvana realized something. Elias Mercer was not just an ally. He was a friend. And maybe, just maybe, something more. The Aelari Palace was quiet at night, but inside, things were changing. Elias Mercer had done the impossible. He had earned the respect of the Aelari warriors. Now, for the first time, the humans and the Aelari were standing as equals. But something still troubled Princess Sylvana. What came next? A dangerous proposal. The next morning, Sylvana sat in the Grand Council chamber. Around her, the highest-ranking members of the Dominion were deep in discussion. They spoke of humans, how they had survived despite their weaker bodies, how Elias Mercer had proven himself stronger than anyone had expected. Some were impressed. Others were still doubtful. One of the elder council members finally spoke. "This human," he said, narrowing his eyes. "He fights well. But can we trust his people?" Sylvana frowned. "The humans have done nothing to betray us." "They have done nothing yet," the elder countered. "But what if they grow stronger? What if they turn against us?" Sylvana clenched her fists. The old ways of thinking still remained. She had seen Elias's strength firsthand, but she had also seen something far more important: his heart. She stood up. "I will speak to the human myself, the princess and the soldier." Elias was sitting on the palace balcony when Sylvana found him. He looked relaxed, as always, watching the sky. He turned as she approached. "You're looking serious, princess. Something on your mind?" Sylvana hesitated. Then she simply asked, "Why did you fight?" Elias raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" She folded her arms. "You did not have to prove anything. You could have walked away. But you fought. And you won. Why?" Elias smiled slightly. "Because I wanted to show you something." Sylvana tilted her head. "Show me what?" "That humans are worth fighting for." She blinked. Elias leaned forward. "Look, I know what your people think of us. Small, weak, chaotic. Maybe they're right. We're not as advanced as the Aelari. We don't have centuries of tradition, but we do have something else." He tapped his chest. "We don't give up. No matter how impossible the fight is, we don't stop trying." Sylvana stared at him. For a long time, she had seen humans as unpredictable, strange, even dangerous. But now, looking at Elias, she realized something. Humans were not dangerous because of their strength. They were dangerous because of their determination. And that made them powerful. The council's decision. Later that evening, Sylvana stood before the council once again. The elders turned to her. "What is your decision, princess?" She took a deep breath. Then she spoke. "We should form an alliance with the humans." A murmur spread across the chamber. One of the elders frowned. "That is a risk." Sylvana met his gaze. "It is a risk worth taking." She glanced at Elias, who stood nearby, watching. "If we do not take this step now, we will regret it in the future." The council members exchanged looks. Then, slowly, one by one, they nodded. A new beginning. That night, as the stars shone above the Aelari Palace, something changed. For the first time, the Dominion and humanity were not just strangers. They were allies. Elias stood beside Sylvana on the balcony, looking at the city below. "So, does this mean we're friends now?" Sylvana smirked. "Perhaps." Elias grinned. I'll take it. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the stars. Then, Elias chuckled. You know, if all Aelari are as stubborn as you, this alliance is going to be interesting. Sylvana raised an eyebrow. And if all humans are as reckless as you, it will be even more interesting. They both laughed. For the first time, the future looked bright. And this was only the beginning. The end.